Thank you.
So today we're going to do what I'm calling back to basics. This is a photo I took in Denali many years ago. The most important thing about a photo is that you can be in the moment, you can enjoy the experience, and you capture the feeling of the place. And all of photography is about capturing light. And in this photo, the different elements that are there are the clouds and the mountains. In the bottom right-hand corner, it's hard to see on everybody's monitor, but there's a nice road leading in. And this was done many, many years ago. And for those of you that haven't been there, for some reason, I've been dreaming about going back to Denali. It's a beautiful place. But in covering the basics, I really want to make sure that we don't get so into the details that you don't see a whole scene, that you don't enjoy the experience. So I'm going to cover a lot of things. They're going to sound at times a little bit intimidating, but I'm going to try to keep them very, very simple. But I more want to know that photography is about light and being in the moment. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is you really do need to, if you don't know where it is to have a copy of your camera manual. And the camera manuals these days either don't come with the cameras, or they're tiny and they're in multiple languages, so they're bigger than they need to be. So the first tip I'm going to give you is go on the internet, search for your camera make and model, and download a PDF of your manual. And if you do travel, it's so important to have that with you. And so I have my camera manuals they're on my iPad. The newer cameras have some built-in help features, but the advantage of being able to find your camera manual and download it is you're able to also search it. Sometimes there's even links. Nikon's done a really wonderful job. Some of their camera models even have a web interface where you can ask a question of what you're trying to do and link to it. Because you should be able to know from these different pictures and all these different numbers, what do all these things mean on your camera? What does this button do? And for people who are more advanced, there are some buttons that I end up doing. If everybody could mute themselves, that would be really helpful. Thank you. For some of the buttons on my camera, I even reassign them different functions. So my buttons do different things, and the more advanced cameras can allow you to do that. But that's the first task of camera basics, is to really know what all these different elements do, so that you can easily remember what to do. And another tip that I realize is some people don't realize is next to the eyepiece on most of the cameras, there's a tiny little adjustment that's a diopter, and it will help you adjust for your vision when you're looking through the eyepiece of your camera. And some people, it's like on binoculars. So just get to know your camera body so that you know what those different parts of the camera mean. And then just a couple of different things of things to have. The first thing is memory cards. Tip on your memory cards is that on most memory cards, the smaller ones, there's a little side lock if you look at the arrows there. And I've been on trips where people have said, my camera's not working, and somehow they've taken their memory card out and they've slid that lock down, and that protects the camera. I will do that after I've been in the field and I know I'm not going to use that card anymore. Memory cards, the most important part on that is that the little metal pins on the back are really important to protect. but they're also pretty rugged. I've had one go through the washing machine and take it out and dry it, and it still worked. So they're pretty good, and they last forever. I have some cards that are pretty old now. The other thing about the cards is that the number of gigabytes. I tend to buy either 64 or 128s now, and it depends on how big your camera images are. But it's important to have enough memory, particularly with these newer cameras. Each one of my images on one of my newer cameras is about 50 megs. So you don't want to run out of memory cards when you've got something that's happening. Sid mentioned that with her new camera, she's got 3 batteries. I have a number of batteries. The one thing about batteries is a couple of things. In really extreme cold weather, they tend to drain down quicker. And so if I'm going out on a very cold day, I'll have my extra batteries close to my body, or if I'm in real cold, like the Arctic, I'll have one of my hand warmers next to my batteries so they don't drain out. But batteries can drain really quickly, particularly on the newer cameras that have lots of electronics. So you want to have extra batteries. And I have some batteries now that don't recharge as good as other ones. And so the more you use them and the more you recharge them, sometimes you do have to replace your batteries from time to time. But the worst thing to be is in the field and have something incredible happen and have no batteries. So if you only have one battery for your camera, I would go and buy a second battery. I also tend not to buy the gray market batteries. I'm really afraid of most of my cameras are Canons. I have an Olympus. I tend to pay the extra and buy the factory batteries. I'm really afraid of a shock or something happening to the camera, and that could really destroy the camera. So that's the one thing I don't go inexpensive on is I get genuine batteries for the camera. The other device that's there is the Rocket. Why it's important to have like a really good air blower is that if you're photographing and you have dust and sand and grit are the biggest enemies of cameras. And I was on the Falkland Island on this one, I have to admit somebody, on this one beach, and it had very, very fine, beautiful white sand. But what was happening is the sand was blowing and it got in everywhere. And so if I had tried to clean my lens without blowing the sand off of it, it would have scratched. The other thing is that I had to have my my lenses covered, particularly where it joins the camera, because that grit, if that grit got into the camera, it would really affect the camera. So before you ever clean your camera, make sure that. Pam, can you mute?
Yeah. Sorry.
I just mute. It's really important to get any grit or sand off of cameras. So rain covers, I've used everything from, I have one that's when I go to British Columbia, because it's a rainforest, that is this really heavy duty cover, and it's made special for heavy rains. But I've also just thrown plastic bags over my camera. And I think the last time I did this, I was teasing Maggie that, I probably was out walking one day and I was looking for newspaper bags because it suddenly started raining. So I try to remember to put something in my pocket to be able to protect the camera if I'm out, because photographing in the rain, it can be really beautiful. Trees are beautiful. I like being in and out during nature. You just have to make sure you protect it. And then the other thing I have is particularly for being in dusty or sandy places is those brushes. I have an old shaving brush that I use if I'm photographing on the beach to try to clean my gear when I get done with a shoot. Because again, grit and sand is really your enemy. When we were done with the Falklands, we took a small little vacuum cleaner where we were staying and had to vacuum not only everything ourselves and our camera gear. It was in between my teeth. That's how much it was blowing, but beautiful. So just some of the things that you need to have. One question that always comes up is, do you use clear lenses, lens filters on the front of your cameras? And for my very big cameras, like my 600 lens, there's no such thing. But on that beach in the Falkland Islands, having been there before, I knew I did get a clear filter to put on the front of my camera. But routinely, day to day, I do not have clear filters on the front of my cameras because I don't want an extra piece of glass between the front of the camera. If you're going to a place that you know is particularly sandy or gritty, then yes, those lenses can help protect the front of the camera. But as a general rule, I've used to do it all the time because I was afraid of wrecking the front of the lens, and now I more want the clarity. So how your camera works, this is just a quick little diagram. Is light comes through the front of the lens, and there's a shutter. Your shutter is like a door that opens and closes. It's and lets light in, and it records on the image sensor. So that's the basic thing. And the picture of the lens, the camera in the middle is a mirrorless camera, and you're looking straight through it. The picture on the right is what a mirrored camera that a lot of you have, and that's doing a reflection of the image. And what has to happen is each time you take the image, the mirror actually flips up so that the image can be recorded back on the sensor. There are times when I'm using my mirrored cameras that if I'm doing landscape and I'm taking multiple brackets of the same image, I lock that mirror up before taking them, because just the mirror flipping up on the older cameras can cause a vibration. And it can then make, if I'm doing 5 images of the same mountain scene, it can make your image shake a little bit, and then it's harder to merge them together. But your image sensor is what film used to do in the old days. Now it's a computerized area with a number of different places where the image light can be recorded. And the image sensor will dictate how many pixels your camera can record. So the newer sensors are superior to a camera that was like 12 years old. So a little bit of when you look through your viewfinder, some of the information, and this is way simplified, of what you can see and what we're going to cover today, is your shutter speed. Again, that's the door that opens and closes to let light in. Aperture, we're going to talk a lot about. That is, your aperture is in the lens. And if you have a camera with interchangeable lenses, the aperture is related to the lens. It is not on the camera body itself. And that's the peephole through which the light comes through. You have an exposure meter, which tells you when the scene is, how you're exposing it, whether you're exposing it for what the camera thinks is perfect, which would be that red arrow in the middle, or whether you're adding light, which would be +1, or whether you're darkening it, going -1. And we're going to talk a lot about exposure. And then the last element here is your sensitivity. And that's the sensitivity by which light is being recorded on your sensor itself. And in the old days, for those of you that used to do film, we would have to look at the day and say, what type of film can we shoot today? And 100 was for a bright sunny day. And then when I was first doing film, 400 was came out, and then 800 came out. And so you had to say, is it a cloudy day? And then once you put that film in the camera, you were stuck with it until you used the roll, or you decided, I'm going to pull it out because the sun's changed, but now I can't take the rest of the pictures that I paid for. And when the digital cameras came out, they used the same type of information as we did with film, but it's an equivalent, and it's a standard, and we'll talk more about that. The other thing I want to mention is a lot of the images I'm using here, there are sources for them that you'll see either a copyright or a website. And when I send you the image, go visit these sites because these are great photographers and they're great resources. And I want to make sure that the people who put some of the images that I reference from the web, that you're able to look at them and give them credit. So this is really simplified. I'm sure with some of the new cameras, you look through them and there's a lot of information that you're seeing either on the back of the camera or through the viewfinder. And again, your manuals will tell you what they are, but these are 4 elements to definitely look for in the information that's being displayed. I'm going to talk just a tiny bit on focusing and give a plug for in 2 weeks, I'm going to be doing bird photography, and I'm going to spend a whole lot of time on focusing and different type of focusing mechanisms. I'm just going to talk real basic here. When we do bird photography, I'm going to talk about the different types of focusing and the tracking mechanisms that the different cameras have that allow you to lock onto a subject and follow it. The most important thing I want everybody to pay attention to is when you look through your viewfinder or when you look on the back of your camera, is where are your focus points? Because a lot of people will get really excited if you come across a bird that you want to photograph, or there's a black bear or a fox, and you start taking pictures and you realize that the focus point was on its butt instead of on its nose or eyes, you know, just because you didn't see what the focus points were doing. And a lot of cameras are set up for autofocus, and what they'll do is they'll light up red and they'll move around. And there is a setting where you can control the focus point so that if you wanted to focus on this kitty cat, probably the focus point I would use is I'd move it up and I'd want to focus on the prominent eye that's looking at me. And if you just let the camera do it on autofocus, unless you have eye detection, it may focus on the middle of the chest, and that may not be where you want it to focus on. So be really aware when you look through your viewfinder, where is your focus point and where is it set? So you want your main focus point, and sometimes you can have multiple focus points. Particularly when I'm doing macro photography, I want one single focus point and I want it as small as I can, and I want to set where it is. I don't want the camera saying, you really didn't want to focus on the middle of the flower. You really wanted to focus on that dewdrop. And I'm like, no, I want to bring it back. So my tendency is to turn off your autofocus. With a camera phone, you pick your focus points by tapping on the screen and locking it. So again, if this was a camera phone, you could pick the eye of the cat, you could press on that, and most of the phones allow you to lock it too. So be aware of where your focus points are. I've seen a lot of great images that have missed out because you have a focus that's just a tiny bit off where you really want it. The other thing about most of the cameras, the pro body cameras, is that your shutter button in the front does two things. It initiates your meter to know, telling the camera how much light is coming in and helping you figure out your exposure. It also opens and shuts your shutter. So sometimes if you don't have time to change your focus point, say it was in the middle, if you press your shutter halfway down, it will hold that focus point. And then if you want to recompose, you can move your camera to the left or right and then press the button the whole way. But what you want to make sure is that your finger doesn't come up. When we do bird photography, I'm going to talk about back button focusing. On my cameras, my shutter button only opens and closes the shutter, and I do focusing from the back of the camera, but that's way advanced. But know that you can press your shutter halfway down, hold it, and then move to where you want it. The other thing about focusing is I'm sure you've all had experiences where you went to focus on something and you hear your camera going back and forth. That's sort of hunting. And your cameras will acquire focus best when there's good contrast between lights and darks. And if you have a bird, for example, sitting in a bush that's sort of dark and there's a lot of twigs, your camera gets confused, your autofocus, and it will hunt around. And sometimes you just have to know it's time to either disable your autofocus and manually focus because you're asking the camera to do more than it can in the lighting. So. Again, it's really important when you bring up a picture for review, or if you are viewing it on the back, to know what all the different symbols on your camera mean. And so these are just, this is just a quick example of a Sony. And so one of the ones to pay attention to is how much battery you have left. The cameras that have a little hand sort of shaky thing, that will tell you that your image stability mode is on. It's telling you that it is helping you stabilize it. The number of pictures left, that's the 1448. On my Canon and most of the Nikons, it's in the bottom right-hand corner. And that's an estimate. That's not an exact science. That's their guess as to how many pictures you have left on the card. The camera mode, we'll talk about that. That's an automatic mode on the Sony. It's an auto intelligence mode. If you were shooting so that you wanted the shutter in priority, it would have a big S there. The focus mode is an autofocus in the center. That's the AFC. And all of them will be different. But again, the ones that we care about for today are the shutter speed. Shutter speed is always 1 over a ratio. So this would be 1 over 80th of a second. That's of a second. Aperture we'll talk about. And in this case, the sensitivity is auto. It's letting the camera decide what sensitivity. So the one I skipped over is image format. I want to come back to that. And there are different types of image formats that you can pick when you're shooting. Most people will shoot in JPEG, but I recommend, as you get more advanced and you are able to do more with post-editing, to shoot in what's called RAW. And RAW the difference is RAW will give you, when you take the card out, more data captured in the field, more of the dynamic range of the camera. It's not compressed. When you photograph in JPEG, the camera's doing the compression and it's deciding on the color spectrum for you. There is an option if you have very large cards to photograph both in RAW and JPEG. The reason people don't like to photograph in RAW is that it does require, before you can post it on Facebook or Instagram or share it with somebody, you have to do a conversion to a format like JPEG. But in future presentations, I want to do more on editing. But if you think you're going to want to do editing, then you can shoot in the RAW format, and then there are a number of packages that can do conversion. Your camera comes with software that allows for conversion. So that's just something to make a decision. If you shoot in JPEG, shoot in the largest one that your camera allows you to do, the most megapixels, because you don't want it compressed tiny coming out of the camera. It's better to have more memory cards than to not. So a couple of other things on the back of this camera. There's the little arrow that's you have a trash can, and to the left of that, there's that arrow. That little arrow is how you review pictures. And then in between that, the plus and minus is going to allow you to change the amount of exposure. So just a few things about knowing the back of your camera, and just take some time and learn what those mean. So this section is, I call it thinking like a camera, because to really understand the basics, if you think like the camera, then when you're in the field, you'll say, oh, I understand what my camera is seeing and what it's doing. So this is the basics. There are 3 factors that we balance, and this doesn't matter if you're shooting with a camera phone or anything. There's 3 factors. All cameras work this way. To get clarity, you can manipulate and decide the shutter speed. Again, that's the door that opens and closes to let light in, and that's on a camera that has interchangeable lenses. That's in the camera. It opens it up. The aperture is in the lens, and that's how wide the little hole through which light's coming through. And then the sensitivity, which is how sensitive the image will be to the light on the sensor. And so you have to have all 3 of them just right to get something that is sharp and clear. And that's our goal, is to have a properly exposed picture and to have it as clear as possible. So let's start with the ISO. And this is an older image that came from a site called exposureguide.com. And you have to look closely on your screens, and you can see at ISO 100, it's less grainy. And as you go up in ISO, it becomes more pixely or grainy. The new cameras allow you to go to a higher ISO without getting as much grain. And one thing I recommend everybody do with their cameras is to figure out what ISO you can go to where it becomes too pixely for what you want to do. So you always want to go with the lowest ISO you can for the light, because it's recording at its most optimal, at its most smooth. And the way to think about it is that if your sensor has a number of different buckets in it, it's how many buckets are recording light. And it's just like the old monitors when we first started using computers. Remember, they were really grainy and pixely, and then we got these incredible iPhones and tablets that have these retina displays, and you can't even see the pixels. But as you increase ISO, you have the problem of the potential is the image is going to get more grainy. So I have 3 different cameras around me, and I know for every camera, here's the top ISO I will use before it's an image that I just really am going to be so unhappy with. Now, the exception is, one year I was watching in a field short-eared owls, and I really wanted a picture of one sitting on a fence post. And I went back there every day almost for this whole winter period. And the last day, when we thought they were gone, the last day, it was dusk. I was driving by in the car, and lo and behold, this one guy hadn't left yet, and he's sitting on the fence in this no light. And I ended up taking that picture at 10,000 ISO because it was the only thing I could do to get enough light to be able to see the owl. And it's okay. There's also software that can help smooth out the pixels, particularly now the software. I could fix sky, but I did lose at 10,000 ISO, I do lose feather detail. But would I not take the picture at all? No, but I knew it would be potentially a grainy picture and that I'd have to do something with it. But in the best case scenario, most cameras under 1,000 ISO is good. Sally's camera does incredible at high ISO. We've gotten a lot of images from Sally, and her ISO has been pretty high, and they're really they're great pictures. The other thing about ISO is that the newer cameras that have high megapixels, I have one that has like over 40 megapixels per picture, and then I have one that has 22. If it's really cloudy out, I pick the lower megapixel camera, because if you think about that sensor with 45 megapixels, there's a lot of light that has to pour into each of those tiny little buckets. It's like having Dixie cups instead of big construction buckets to pour the light into. So the more megapixels that you have on these newer cameras that are pushing up, sometimes the ISO noise becomes more of a problem for them. So everybody understand but this is a factor that you balance. You say, okay, for the light, here's how much light I need, and here's a decision that I'm going to make around the ISO setting. So let's go to shutter speed. Again, the shutter speed is what's opening and closing quickly on the camera to let light in. And the quicker it opens up, the less light that's in there, but you're going to get less blur. So in this example, and people have done classes with me know that I torture them with real pinwheels, so that when we can get together, there will be pinwheels, that if you set your camera speed at 1/80th of a second, you're going to get blur if there's motion. And you can try this with a ceiling fan in your house, if you have anything. And then as you go up in shutter speed, you're going to stop the motion of that pinwheel. So fast shutter speed stops motion. Why do we care about that? If you have an animal that's running, a grandchild that's running, a bird that's flying, if you're on a boat, the faster the shutter speed, the less blurry your image is going to be. But what do you lose when you do fast shutter speed? That door is open and shut very quickly. So there's not a whole lot of light coming in to fill up your sensor. So fast shutter speed, great for stopping motion. The disadvantage is you need a lot of light to let the sensor record that image.
I see. That's super.
And again, this is all in 1/1000th of a second. Think about how incredible these instruments are that can take these pictures. So sometimes we do want to have a slow shutter speed. It's not always that fast is good. Slow sometimes is what we're trying to do with our shutter speed. So these compare the waterfalls at different shutter speeds. And again, this is 1/30th of a second. It's really, really slow. And what you get with slow shutter speed is you get this really nice, smooth water. And if you don't have a waterfall, try this at your house. Just run some water, tap water, and do it at different shutter speeds and see the difference. Or put a bucket where you're catching water in it and watch the drips come in. So what happens is that if I wanted to capture the detail of the water, I probably would have gone faster, just to not, because it's sort of not attractive to have the high shutter speed. The low one will make the water seem silky. Now, the problem with doing waterfalls, and maybe we'll do waterfalls in April or May. April's a great month because there's water in the park, is that if you have a slow shutter speed, there's a couple of things that can happen. You can get blur if you're not on a tripod because you're moving. The other thing in a waterfall setting is if you have any wind at all, these leaves that are there will look blurry. So sometimes when you get these incredibly wonderful pictures of waterfalls, the photographer's actually taken 2 pictures, one with the leaves and settings, and one with the water, and combine them. The other thing is, and you can almost see if you look real carefully at the leaves on the left versus the right, the ones on the right are a little bit too overexposed. You see the green, I just noticed that the green on the left is a little bit better. The scene on the right is a little bit bright. The other thing, the reason that waterfalls are tricky to do is that if you're going to slow your shutter speed way down, you're letting in a ton of light. So if it's a bright sunny day, it's really hard to do waterfalls. It's much better if they're in a darker area. And there are filters you can put on the front of your camera to darken what's coming in. They're called neutral density filters. And what it does is it darkens the scene so that you can have this incredible slow shutter speed. Because as opposed to the problem with bird photography, where I want a ton of light coming in to be able to have that quick exposure, if I have a ton of light coming in and I'm trying to do a waterfall at slow, it will be too bright. So how do you prioritize shutter speed on your cameras? There's 2 different ways of doing that. If you're using a pro body camera, or if you get like an app like Pro Camera, you want to prioritize shutter speed. And most cameras, it will be you turn to the S mode, which is shutter priority. Or if you want to do it in an auto setting, if there's a sports mode, just hit sports mode. And most Samsung Androids have a sports mode. So you can actually use that as your quick and to prioritize the shutter. So those are just two different ways. All right, so 2 images. These are both taken on South Georgia Island. This is a church on the only place that's a settlement. And the other one is an albatross flying overhead. So we know which image needs a faster shutter speed. Everybody knows B, because the bird's flying and the church isn't going anywhere, unless there's an earthquake, but we don't want that. As you increase your shutter speed, the amount of light coming in with the church, it's a slow shutter speed. It was sort of dark, more lights coming in. When I went up to take a picture of the bird, if I'm at a fast shutter speed, I have less light coming into the camera, even if the light is the same around me.
Right and left of the arrow paths.
And if I used a very slow shutter speed on the bird, it would have blur.
Turning around.
If I used a slow shutter speed on the church, not much would happen unless I moved or if the clouds were moving really super fast behind it.
Huh.
And the advantage of using a slow shutter speed on the church is that I can get more of the front of the church and the back of the church all to be in focus, and I'll explain that. So some examples. This is 1/2000, because trying to stop the motion of a dragonfly in flight is really difficult. I probably sat there for many, many hours doing that, but they're moving really super fast. And if I hadn't been at least at 1/2000, I would get blur. Now, everybody's cameras are going to be different as to how fast your shutter speeds can go up. With a camera phone, I would do this in video and hope. I showed this the last time I did this. This was really, really dark, and I did it over 1/250, which is like, usually you would say it's a bird. I just had to take a lot of pictures and, you know, hope I wasn't moving, the bird wasn't moving, and sometimes you get lucky. But that's as I wanted to get that much light in. But in that case, I took a number of pictures. I just was on rapid fire, because what happens is if you don't have a lot of light and you need to slow down your shutter speed, if you take a bunch of pictures, you may hit it. You may get that one in the sequence. So same thing on your camera phones. If you think that you have movement, take a bunch of pictures. Because it is really hard to get the hummingbirds with the light just hitting their throats, so that you get the detail in the feathers too. Some more examples, and again, we'll do bird photography in a couple of weeks. If you want to get the tips of the bird's wings not to blur, you have to be at 1/3200. That's the general rule. And if you have more light, if your camera allows it, 6400. So with bird photography, speed is your friend, and you just hope to have light. And so to get that picture of the tree swallow at that moment, this was not just a one lucky photo. This was standing there for quite some time with a lot of misses. That's the other thing with bird photography. 1/1600 of the hummingbird on the other side, you'll see the tips of the wings blur. The body is pretty, it pretty much stopped the motion, but you will get wing blur of smaller birds, because if you think about how quick the hummingbird's wings are moving, and it's okay. Some people like the blur on wings. I personally love it when I can get that, to have the whole tips of the wings all the way totally sharp, but that takes a little bit doing. So you see the effects of shutter speed on what you're capturing. It's how quick it's opening and closing. And just by the way, this is a young boy hummingbird, because you can see his throat's just coming in, those dots coming down. In the summer, they look like they look a little bit closer to the females. So, any questions on shutter speed?
If you use a higher shutter speed, how is that for light?
How is it for light?
So if you're going up to 1/1600.
You need a lot of light.
So if you have a gray day, is there any way to offset that?
We'll talk about those choices. We're going to do a whole thing on trade-offs of those different choices. So yes. It's light, light, it's all about light. And the problem with wildlife photography and other photography is when you get the most light, you have shadows and the wildlife aren't out and it's the worst time to take pictures. So, you know, it is a challenge. You can stop motion, particularly with hummingbirds, with multiple flashes. And those are taken at your sync rate. So they're actually taken at only 250 over of a second. But the flash stops the motion. That's like a whole complex thing. And I prefer not to use flash on wildlife. That's just my personal opinion. Okay, so I'm going to shift and talk about the next factor. And if you look at this picture, and this picture is a stock image that I got off a Getty site, and it perfectly demonstrated what I wanted, is you look at it and you say, boy, that front bee is really nice and focused and the back bee isn't. You know, so why do we have a blurry bee? And it's not because of shutter speed. This is because of aperture and depth of field. And this is why depth of field is so important. And you can tell it's about depth of field because the front bee is totally in focus, as well as the flower in the middle is really nice and focused. And then you see the front of the flower and the back of the flower and the second bee are not in focus. This is what aperture does in terms of focus. And some people get confused and will say, gee, I thought I had my focus set really well, and I thought I had the speed set really well. And you know the speed's high on this because, you know, bees move around a lot. So it wasn't, the answer's not shutter speed, and there's a ton of light. Actually, it's a little bit overexposed. So this is all about aperture and depth of field. And here's where I want to spend a lot of time, because your camera phones also will affect depth of field. So why depth of field matters. Another example, and these are two pictures that I took. The picture on the left is a mountain gorilla. And this was, you know, taken many years ago. And I think I was just sort of, you know, I wasn't, I'm going to wait to my clock, my nuthatch. Okay, nuthatch is done singing. I wasn't as skilled, and it was like, oh my God, oh my goodness, there's a mountain gorilla and I'm really darn close to this big mountain gorilla. But if you notice, the front of the nose is not as sharply focused as the eyes. And does it spoil the picture? No. But if I could go back and get close to that gorilla again, I would want more depth of field so that the nostrils and the eyes were both in focus. You know, the picture's on my wall. It's not terrible, but depth of field matters. And the other example is a picture I took recently of this praying mantis. And I was pretty darn close to the praying mantis. And they're difficult to get in focus. And you'll see that the legs coming down and the eyes and the antenna are all in focus, but his front legs aren't. And that's as best I could do with the camera and the equipment. But I knew that my focal point had to be on the eyes and the body. And again, it's good picture, but and I ended up softening it a little bit all around the edges in post-processing, just so that you go to the eyes. Depth of field matters. It would matter even more if I missed the eyes because of depth of field. Another example of why depth of field matters, and this is a stock footage photo I took from Getty. It's a little oversaturated, but it makes the point that I wanted to make. In landscape, depth of field, if you want to get a foreground element and you want a midground element and some of the back in focus, you have to have a lot of depth of field, because the picture would look funny if the front rocks were blurry or if the middle rock with the trees on it were blurry. And when I first heard depth of field, I always thought it had to do with mountains, but I always like to show a picture of an insect or something. That depth of field matters when you're close to objects too. Depth of field matters when you do macro photography. And what depth of field is the amount of apparent focus within the image in the foreground, midground, and foreground. And that can be whether it's this picture of the rocks all the way to the mountains in the back, or it's the little tiny praying mantis legs all the way to its antennae. So again, when I first heard this, I said, oh, depth of field, you know, would just be for landscape, and it's not. It's for everything you do. Everything is affected by depth of field when you're doing photographs. So what is the depth of field? Again, this is really important to know. The depth of field is your aperture in the lens of the camera. It is not in the body of the camera, it's in the camera lens. And every camera lens has a different range of settings that you can do. So I have some lenses that start at 5.6 and go to f22. I have other lenses that start at f2.8, and I even have one that is even lower than that. So again, this is how wide the aperture or that peephole in the lens opens up when you go to fire your camera. And it's almost counterintuitive that the wider it opens up, the less depth of field you have. The smaller it is, like a pinhole, the more depth of field you have. And not all of your lenses will have all these different options. And if you have a zoom lens, I have one zoom lens that's f2.8. It will allow me to be at f2.8 through the whole zoom. I have another lens that starts at 5.6, and when I zoom to get a close-up, it goes to 7.1. That's the lowest aperture that I can have, the most wide open. And that has to do with how much glass is in the front of the lens. So the big heavy lenses, my lens that goes to 1 something and has range in it, has a lot of glass in the front. This other lens that I have is lighter, but I have less aperture. So you would think, well, if I open it up, so I'm opening the aperture wide up, it should let in more of the image. I should have more depth of field, but it's the opposite. You always have to think opposite. And the only thing I can think of is sometimes I'll put my finger up to my eye or do a little hole, and I look through it, and it actually, when I look through and I constrict what I can see left and right, you focus on more in the distance. So everybody understand that. And then you can look on this chart, as you change your aperture, as you go from like f4 to f22, look at how much light you're losing each time you set your aperture smaller and smaller. So at f22, you have 1/64th of the light you had at f2.8. You lose an incredible amount of light. It's a multiplier every time you go up. So more depth of field, less light. And oftentimes you'll need a slower shutter speed to compensate for that loss of light. How do you control depth of field? There's on most cameras, it's A for aperture.
Okay.
And I should know this, on the Canons, it is
Flash.
AV. I'm so automatic, I don't even think about it. And that means aperture value. If you're using settings that are just the program settings, it can be the mountain, and the mountain will give you more depth of field. It can be the portrait, which will give you mid depth of field, or the flower oftentimes gives you the least depth of field. Canon and Nikon do it differently. So everybody figures how to do that. How you control depth of field on your iPhone is you tap your focus area, and then you try to not have infinite amount of scene behind the camera, because the camera phones will keep looking for that depth of field. So if I'm doing a flower, I'll look for a flower next to a rock, and it will trick the iPhone to having more depth of field. So examples of depth of field. Assuming that you're standing in the same place and you're using the same camera lens, and I will send some exercises for everyone to do. If you are at the most wide open aperture, again, that peephole, f1.4, and you had this row of birds sitting in the tree, and you focused on the mid bird, the birds in the front and the birds in the back will be blurry. Just like on the flower with the bee, the flower in the front was blurry and the back bee was blurry. As you increase your aperture setting, which is making it smaller, you get more mid-range depth of field. The birds now in the middle at f5.6 are in focus. And at f22, which is your aperture at the smallest opening possible, you're getting all the birds in the front and all the birds in the back in focus, but you're losing the amount of light coming in. Everybody see the difference in aperture. So Sydney, on your new camera, if you want to take a picture of a flower and that flower is at an angle and you want the whole thing in, you need to be at a very small opening to get as much of it in focus as possible. If you're at the ocean and you want the rocks in the front, the rocks in the middle, and mountains, I just need to let a couple of people in. If you want to, again, that picture of the ocean that I had, that is at like an f22 or even higher. That's the only way that camera is going to take in all of the pictures, all of the information.
And
Your camera phones, some of them are defaulted at f1.4 and some of them are in the 2s. So you have to understand with your camera phones, you have a very shallow depth of field. So where you focus matters a whole lot. This is a great picture. Again, please visit the websites that I have when I send this. So a shallow depth of field on the left is like f1.8. You see that the king is in focus, and all of the images in the front and the back all of those other chess pieces fall out of focus. At f16, assuming that you're in the same place with the same camera, now you get the full array of chess pieces are in focus. And your focus point is the same. You still set your focus point on the king, which is in the middle. Less light coming in on the one on the left, more light coming in on the one on the right. So two things have to happen. You either have to have a slower shutter speed at f16, or you change your sensitivity. And we'll talk about those trade-offs.
How do you move it?
And it's really good to go and try doing this with some objects and purposely saying, I want to focus just on the front one and not anyone in the back. I want to focus and set this up and really play with your cameras and your lenses to see what you can do. Sometimes I even will put cans, like soda cans with ingredients facing on the same type of angle to see if I can get the words in the front and the words in the back to focus. And again, you can do that focus point wise on your camera phones by tapping where you focus on. I want you to notice though, the reason why these chess pieces fall out of focus is they're not on the same plane of focus. If we change this and we line them up like little soldiers and they were all on the same plane of focus, they'd all be in focus. The reason they fall out of focus is because some are closer in the front and some are further away in the back. So plane of focus really matters. So what can you do if you had only your camera phone? You wouldn't ever try to take this at a distance unless you wanted to have some blurring in the front and some blurring in the back. So when you're taking a picture of a flower, if it's perfectly parallel to you, you're going to get more of it in focus. The problem is when things are angled to where your front of your camera is. So again, some good examples of depth of field. So sometimes we want a shallow depth of field. We say we really want to blur the flowers in the background and we purposely go to a lower f-stop. Or if you wanted all of the flowers in focus, you can see the difference on the right is f32 versus f2.8. So you're getting a feel for what happens as you change your aperture. All right, so some real life examples. And again, these are some stock footage. So say I don't have a lot of light and I'm at a lower f-stop. If I wait for the bird to turn, so the bird is perfectly parallel to the plane of focus, I'm going to get the eye and the beak and everything in focus, because it's not just, it's whether things are in the foreground, the midground, or the background where your plane of focus starts to matter with your f-stop. Now, if I have a bird who's turned to me and I want the tip of the bill as well as the eye to be in focus, and I'm close to that bird, I need a ton of depth of field. So the important thing to remember about depth of field is it's how parallel you are and the camera is to the subject. The minute you start to have this rotation where some of the important elements are closer and further away from your main focus point, the more you need depth of field. So if you have a mountain range that looks perfectly flat to you, it doesn't matter. If it's in the distance, you could shoot that with very little depth of field because it's flat. If you have rolling hills and a tree as a foreground element, and you want all of that, you need more depth of field because more of the elements you want are not parallel to the camera. And a lot of people never explain that with depth of field. They just start throwing out numbers. And this is why it matters, particularly when you're doing bird photography, because having a really shallow depth of field on the crane or the egret on the right, the heron, it would blur that whole front of it, it would be distracting. The plane of focus matters. Again, here you see this butterfly, and you know it's a shallow depth of field. I know it's shallow even without seeing the camera settings, because the flowers in the background are fading really pretty, but the flower that you are focused on with the butterfly is really nice and sharply focused, because the butterfly and that little flower are almost on the same plane of focus. And particularly if you tilted your camera a little bit so that it followed that yellow line, you're going to have that butterfly and that flower, and everything will be nicely in focus. But if you, and so that's also why it's really good to be aware of how are you holding your camera relative to what you're taking the picture of. Because the minute, again, things are further away from the camera or closer in the front to where your focus point is, the more you need depth of field. Is this making sense? And so with an iPhone, if you are an Android phone, if you were able to hold it perfectly parallel, you're going to get that whole scene in focus. If you hold it straight, if you are holding it straight, you're going to see that not all of it is on the same plane of focus. Same thing with this butterfly. The reason it's, and you know it's a low, we know it's a low depth of field because look how beautiful the background is falling out of place. And you can even, if you really look at the marigold in the front petals of that flower are a little blurry. So the plane of focus and the way I would hold the camera would be according to that yellow line, and then the butterfly and from the wings to the head to the antenna all fall into focus because that's the plane of focus. Here's an example where the back wings of the butterfly are not in focus. And if now study and really look at the dewdrops on the flower. So the dewdrops on the flower that are outside where I have the red line, they're not as in focus and clear as the dewdrops are where the plane of focus, where the photographer was taking that picture. And everything along that edge falls into focus. The dewdrops, the eye, and the front wing. And in this case, the photographer had a really nice background. It would have improved the photo if they had the light to do so, to up the f-stop to get more depth of field. I would have liked to have seen the dewdrops on the left more in focus, as well as the back wings. So when you're doing macro photography, the depth of field, more of it will be in focus. It's a lovely photo, and we tend to fill in details, just like on my gorilla's nose. You'd say, well, that's a great photo. You fill in the details. But when you're in the field, if you have the choice and you start to understand those wings of the butterfly aren't together. If the wings of the butterfly were together, you might need less depth of field. The minute it starts to open up and you have more elements that are further away, not on the same plane of focus, the more you need depth of field as a choice if you want it all to appear to be in focus. Plane of focus. Here's two cranes. Again, it's a stock one that I found on Getty, but it's a perfect example of if I have two birds flying, I immediately, if I want both of them in focus, I immediately think I need to increase the depth of field. Now, is this an interesting picture? Sure. You can make the choice to say, I want the back bird out of focus. But the reason the back bird is out of focus is not because the back bird's moving. It's not because we don't have enough shutter speed. It's because of depth of field. And to me, my choice as a wildlife photographer, I want that back bird in focus. Now, if I don't have any light, I might decide I'm going to live with only the front bird being in focus because of the trade-off. But depth of field has an incredible effect on pictures. So if we want to make both bees in focus here, what do? We make our aperture a higher aperture number, decreases the light. There was plenty of light here. There's almost too much light. But that's a choice too. You may say artistically, I want the background blurred. But that's why the bee isn't in focus. It's the problem is aperture. And we know that because the front of the flower is blurry, the back of the flower is blurry. And the person was really, really close to the. So a couple of other things that affect your depth of field is that the distance from your subject will affect the depth of field. The more you are close up to something, the more you need depth of field. So here's the example. The person standing there 20 feet away from the 3 dots versus 5 feet away. If you're 5 feet away, the front and back dots would be out of focus and the middle one would be in focus. If you're 20 feet away, same camera, same settings, all of them are in focus. So one of the things you can do is if you don't have depth of field is back away from your subject and crop later. Backing away will increase the depth of field. That's why on an iPhone or an Android phone, your landscape pictures look good if you're so far away from the subject. If you're really, really far away from the subject doing landscape and you don't have any foreground elements, you don't need a lot of depth of field because you're so darn far away from those mountains. They will appear in focus. And this diagram's from B&H Photo, and they're a great place if you want to shop and have a big budget. Another one from B&H, and this is, I'm going to send some examples for people who have different lenses. This is the same picture taken standing in the same place with the same settings, but with different focal lengths. So a 70 millimeter focal length is a wider focal length, and more of your picture will be in depth of field when you're at 70 versus 200. So one of the tricks I do for my macro photography is if I'm out doing bird photography, but I see a really cool flower, is I use my telephoto lens. And my telephoto lens, I sometimes do my macro at 400. And what 400 does is it really nicely blurs the background for flowers. So you have less depth of field, you get more compression with longer lenses. And so for people who have a whole arsenal of different lenses or different things, or have a telephoto lens where you can experiment, then it's great to be able to try something at different distances at the same setting and see what it does to depth of field. Because a lot of depth of field is not always what we want. Sometimes we want to have that real creamy background all around the subject. The key is you have to make sure, like I said before, that your focal point is dead on the subject to get that nice blur. So telephoto lenses compress. So what does that mean? We were out doing loon photography, lying on our bellies, and we all had like 600 millimeter lenses, and we get up close to these loons who, you know, have like long beaks, and, you know, they'll move their heads. Sometimes they're not cooperative. We needed a lot of depth of field if we wanted to get the eye through the beak all sharply focused, because we had these mega lenses on with the loons. So we're shooting at a minimum of 5.8 to make sure we had the whole lenses in nice portrait. So you have to know your lenses and know what they do with depth of field. So just a review, this is 2 pictures I took in Denali again. The one on the left, A, is fireweed. And if you've been to Alaska, when the fireweed, it loses its flowers from the bottom to the top. And so you can tell this is the end of the season in Denali. And so the one on the left has a shallow depth of field because the flowers are in focus and the mountain isn't. The one on the right has more depth of field because the lake, the foreground vegetation is in focus all the way to the geese that were flying overhead and the mountains. So as I increased the depth of field in B, there was less light coming into the camera. Sunset, say the sun's setting and I'm at f8 or in a landscape mode if I'm in auto. And I'm at ISO 200 or less. And I would say I was in, I went into aperture priority. What your camera does in aperture priority is you can set the aperture and you set the sensitivity, and your camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed to get it to be right in that middle range of where it thinks it should be. So as the sun's setting, if I was in aperture priority mode, my shutter speed would be decreasing as the sun was setting, which is why a lot of times with sunset photography, you want to be on a tripod. And you just have to look at your different settings. And what would I do if I wanted to keep the f-stop at f8 and my shutter speed was starting to get so slow? I might up the ISO. Just a couple of other examples of decisions. With the dragonfly, to get the tip of the nose to the tip of the tail, I was at f20, slow shutter speed, 1/3200. I waited for it to rest on this little branch. And even though it was a sunny day, I was at 1600 ISO. On the one on the bottom, I'm at a higher shutter speed. And the difference is, if you look real carefully, there's a little bit of wing blur in the one on the top. On the one on the bottom, I really wanted to get incredible crisp detail of the sort of the nice netting on the wings. So I upped the shutter speed to 1/1000. My ISO is, you know, almost equivalent. And I went to F13, but even at F13, notice that the back of the dragonfly's teal is starting to not be as in focus. Like each of the joints, as you go back on that plane, each of the joints get a little tiny bit more fuzzy. But again, a trade-off. I wanted to get the detail in the front. So the trade-offs. Everything with photography is a trade-off between speed, aperture, and ISO. And here is the exposure triangle. And these three elements work together. Exposure, aperture, and sensitivity. So the higher the sensitivity, more light comes in. The trade-off is it may be more grainy or pixely. Exposure time, the faster the shutter speed, the more you're going to stop motion. But sometimes you do want to stop motion like a waterfall. The faster the shutter speed, the less light. Aperture, which is your lens opening, again, the peephole. The larger it is, which is actually smaller. It says large, but it's actually smaller. At f32, the less light. The wide open aperture, you have more light, but your shutter speed needs to be adjusted for that. There are different settings, as I mentioned, on your camera. Program mode, most cameras have a P or a program mode. The camera will set both your f-stop and your shutter, and you can choose different combinations. If you were in a position where, you know, the Bigfoot suddenly emerged in the woods and you were like panicked because you wanted to be the first person to document Bigfoot, if there's no reason not to go to program mode, which is like an auto mode. You know, don't be ashamed if you're like saying, I'm going to miss it, just throw it on program mode. Don't worry about it. TV or S in the Nikon and Sony world. TV is a Canon for time value. You set the shutter you want, the camera will pick the f-stop, and you also decide what your ISO is. I very rarely ever will pick shutter priority because I want to know what my depth of field is. Depth of field is everything to me. So I very rarely use this. I know if you've taken Rob Simpson's class for bird photography, he recommended shutter priority and recommended to set it for 1,000. I think the newer cameras, you can push your settings. And what it's going to do in most cases, if you're in shutter priority, unless you're in really bright sun, you're going to be at the lowest. If you set it for like bird photography and you set it at 1,000 or even more, it's going to automatically take your aperture down to your lowest, to being as wide open and the least depth of field. And what can happen is at 5.6, if you are lucky enough to be close to that heron, you're not going to get the full bird in focus. So I tend not to use shutter priority. There are times where if I'm on a boat or something and I know I can't fuss with everything, there's a time and place for it, but I tend not to use that mode on my camera. Aperture priority, which is A in most modes and AV in Canon. you set the f-stop and the camera will do the shutter speed, and you also set the ISO. The disadvantage of that is that if I decide I want f8 for doing bird photography and all of a sudden it's getting dark, I have to really watch what my shutter is being set at and up my ISO if the shutter gets too low. Manual exposure, you set everything. And I tend to shoot in manual exposure with auto ISO because I know my camera can handle the higher ISO. So that way I can say, this hummingbird, I'm so close. I want to be at f8 and I want to be at 3200, and I'll take the hit on ISO. I'll let that camera go up and I can set the maximum ISO on that camera. My other option is to set all three of them. On days where the sun's not coming in and out, I'll do manual exposure. On days where the clouds are coming in and out and I would have to be changing my ISO anyhow, I will set auto ISO. There's a disadvantage of that though. We'll talk about. So those are the basic ones that you have on most of the Pro Body cameras. If you want to use your auto settings, here are examples of what the different auto settings will do with depth of field and with the other settings. The auto settings also change some of the color range as well. So on portrait, you're in the middle. You have a little bit of a shallow depth of field to medium, a fast shutter speed, and your tones are neutral. Sports mode will be the quickest setting. And what it does is it will decrease your aperture and it will increase your ISO. With macro on these, Canon is a shallow depth of field. Nikon did the opposite, thinking that if you wanted the whole flower. Landscape, of course, will give you the most depth of field, but it will also make your tones a little bit more vivid. It adds to the color. But the cool thing is on the cameras to use night portrait or night photography or sunset. They just do different adjustments. So just to review on the trade-offs is if you look at these two, we have a giant trillium, which was taken with flash up at Thompson. And we have another dragonfly, which was taken with a telephoto. So you look at these two trade-offs and the flower wasn't moving, it wasn't windy. The dragonfly was moving and I was further away from it with a telephoto lens. You can tell that because the grass in the background is nicely out of focus. So of course, the match is that flower was at f22 and a slow shutter speed. If it wasn't at f22, that very front petal all the way to the back, there's no way it would be in focus, especially when I was close. You see the green leaves are in focus, and all the way you can see the venation of the flower all the way in the back plane. The dragonfly is a shallow depth of field, but I'm not really close to it like those other dragonflies. And the front wing is a little bit less sharp, but your eye fills it in. But I went for speed. Whenever I'm doing wildlife photography, I prioritize speed. And I'm oftentimes shooting with a telephoto lens and I'm not close to my subject. So speed gets prioritized. Two different mountain goats, and they're both at the same shutter speed. So you look at the two, you can see, again, these are cropped a little bit, and I had my telephoto lens. You can see that the eye, I hit the eye on the one on B, my focus point was on the eye. But if you go all the way to the end of those ram horns, they're blurring a little. Again, I could have upped the, I'm sorry, that there are different. F8 is the one B, but even at F8, because I was so close to the ram, the very back of the horns blur a tiny bit. I could have been higher if I had more light or if I had more time. But the one on the left, A, is obviously F4, and Mama is out of focus. Sort of the same thing that we saw with the two cranes together, but it's not a bad photo. It tells the sort of story of them. It wasn't intentional. It was just, we jumped out of a van and that's what my camera was set at. So one of the things you want to do is always know what your default settings are on your camera. When I walk around with my, I have a 1:500 telephoto lens, and I walk all the time with it on my default always is the lowest f-stop and 1/1000, because I'm set for wildlife. If I see a flower, I can change settings with it. But my default is always for quick action. So Mama in A gets blurred out because of F4. The ram on B, I could have gone up on f-stop if I had the light and gotten all the way to the very tip of the horns. But the eye's in focus on both of them, which is really good. Some more examples. Again, the prioritizing of the different examples. Which one needed the quickest shutter speed? So again, my decision making always is shutter speed, unless I'm doing landscape and macro. If I'm doing birds or wildlife, it's always shutter speed. So B matches to number 3. The eagle's at 1/4000. The water's stopped and the tip of the wings are stopped. The two cranes flying together are F8/1600. Bigger birds flying do not need 3200. Anything between 1200 and 1600 will do the beats of the smaller birds. And see the cedar waxwing, you can tell that's at a shallow. There wasn't a whole lot of light because the front of this cedar tree is blurred as well as the background. And even the top of the cedar waxwing's little crest is a little bit blurry. And probably, if I had it to do over again, if I had more light there, if I hadn't had yucky cedar branches in the background, I would have maybe gone with a higher f-stop. But I didn't like the background. I didn't want the rest of the cedar tree to be in focus. So those are the trade-offs and the decisions that you make when you do your different decisions of. And then I go with what ISO will it tolerate to get to my goals. So is my goal setting it up and wanting to manipulate how much in the foreground and the background's in focus, or is my goal stopping action? And if it's stopping action, I will sacrifice ISO first and then depth of field second. That's the decision making that I do as I'm looking at it. For wildflowers, if I want the whole flower in focus, I'm either going to change my plane of focus so I'm as parallel with it as possible. I'm going to use the most depth of field possible, And if I have to, I'll augment with light, flash, external light, whatever I need to do. Okay, so one more thing we'll talk about, and I could do a whole thing on exposure. So all of this counts on taking these three elements to making a good decision so you have a properly exposed picture. Not too bright, not too dark, just right. So again, when I started, I talked about looking through your camera, and you'll have something that looks like this information on the right, which will have a midpoint and it will have pluses and minuses. When your camera thinks that you have the best possible exposure, you will see something between the -1 and the +1, right in the middle. Your camera will say, ah, this is the right exposure. And sometimes the camera makes a good decision, and sometimes it doesn't make the best decision because it's a machine and it's limited. And sometimes we have to, either if we're using manual exposure, decide that we're going to override what's just right with a little less light or a little more light. And if you're in Aperture or Shutter Priority, you use something called exposure compensation, which is on your camera, you find the plus/minus setting or button. And then on the back of your camera, you will purposely dial up or dial back. So on the example on the left, the person was in manual exposure. They have a really slow shutter speed of 1/40th of a second, or 1/4 seconds. Very wide open, they're 2.8. So that's a little bit of information that you see there. So when do we have to use exposure compensation? Well, let's think about what your camera is doing in terms of metering. And metering is the camera taking in the amount of reflective light to say, how much light does the sensor need for the way the ISO is set? And most of us are using what's called evaluative or matrix metering. And this is what your iPhones or Android phones are doing too. And what it's doing is it's recording the light for the whole scene, and it's taking an average for the whole scene. And so on the back of your cameras, you're going to see a symbol for evaluative or matrix, these different types of symbols. Center weighted metering is your camera is considering the amount of light just in the middle of the picture. So it would, in this case, just meter off the sandstone building. Spot metering is taking a very small little area and ignoring all the rest of the picture. I don't recommend using anything but evaluative or matrix unless you're really advanced. You know, I have done spot metering, but then if I move my camera away from that spot, it's not metered correctly. So it can be, it doesn't, once you meter for the spot, it will not keep readjusting, at least on the Canons. The Nikons are a little bit better. So you have to keep remembering you're getting the average of the reflective light in the whole scene. So if we look at the scene, in this one in particular, and I was on either, if I meter off the whole scene and I all of a sudden see a bird flying in the sky and I go up, it's seeing a lot of light because there's all that light coming into my meter, and it's saying, oh my goodness, we need less light. And it will make the picture of that bird too dark. So you have to understand what your metering's doing. When I take a bird flying in the sky, I always +1 to 2 if I am not manually exposed. Manual exposure will not do that. If you manually set and your light's not changing, if you take a picture on the horizon or you point up, your settings stay the same. With the auto settings, your camera's going to start adjusting. Either if you're in speed priority, it will adjust the aperture. If you're in aperture, it will adjust the speed, and it's doing it automatically. The other thing that your camera does when it meters is it will bring to that midpoint. If your camera is showing something lit up in between the pluses and minuses, it takes white and it thinks it's 18% gray. When it looks at something all white, it's saying, oh my goodness, so much light's coming in, we need to go to 18% gray. And the reason the cameras do this is that midtones is what it likes to meter off of. So if you're doing manual exposure, if you're doing full manual, the way that I meter is I will find like a sunny day and I don't know if the birds are going to be on the ground or in the sky. I will first meter the light off of green trees. I will blur my focus so that all the reflective light's coming in from a midtone. I'll meter in the middle and then I'll leave it alone unless the light changes. If I'm in auto ISO or something, I have to be very careful when I move my camera because my settings will not stay. And what will happen is if you're advanced and you meter off, like on a sunny day like today, and I meter off something in a midtone, and I get my settings perfectly well, when I point to the sky, it will be 2 stops to the right, and that's perfectly exposed. If I let any of the auto settings go, I have to overexpose. And that's because the camera keeps wanting to make things that are very bright, darker, or very dark, brighter. I know that's a lot, but for those that are advanced, you'll get it. So how do you know if you're properly exposed? Your histogram is your tool. And a lot of people hate histograms, but they are the most important way of knowing that you have proper exposure of your picture. And we can do we'll do a whole thing on exposure and histograms because it is like the most perfect way of telling it. So your histogram is first off, it's not the bell curve that you used to be tortured in school with. What your histogram's telling you is how much of your picture is in shadows or in highlights. And shadows are blacks, highlights are white, and midtones are green, brown, red. They're your midtones of your camera. And what it's telling you is how much data your camera has in these different things. And a picture that has the most detail is properly exposed for the highlights. Because you can always add shadows later, but you cannot add detail well. So the first thing you know is there's no ideal histogram. There's optimal histograms for different settings. It represents a tonal range that you want to convey. And the most important thing is you don't want your histogram to be touching either of the ends of that histogram. That means it's clipping or your lost data in your shadows or your highlights. So here's an example. This is a really great example of the different parts of the picture and where it's being represented in the histogram. And I will send you the slides. So your dark shadows are over to the left-hand side. And as you get towards midtones, it's the middle. And as you get to the very brightest area, it starts to come to the right. And the ocean is sort of a little right of your midtones. And in this picture, it is clipped on both ends. That histogram's hitting both ends. And so if this was my picture, what do I need to do? I need to lessen a little bit. The difficulty in this picture is if I fix the clipping on the right, I'm going to lose detail in the shadows. So in this case, in reality, I'd probably take two pictures, properly exposed for the highlights, properly exposed for the shadows, because your camera can't do both. But if I had to pick, I probably would want to make this picture less exposed because I have no detail in the whole upper right-hand corner. And that's represented by the histogram hitting the right-hand side. It's incredibly important information. So when we do bird photography, we want to have our histogram be a little bit to the right without, again, hitting all the way to the right. Mainly because, again, if I want to add dark or shadows, I can do that later in post-processing. But to get feather detail, I need to expose for the highlights. There's a photographer whose name is Chaz, and he says, you know, light illuminates, shadows define. That's his, and his company's called Shoot the Light. And he's really good. He's a Canon master, and you can get some of his presentations online. He is an acquired taste, though. He's a great photographer. So the bird on the right, the histogram would look like this. It's a little bit to the right without being totally overexposed. When you clip down on the picture on the very bottom, that chest of the bird literally on photographic paper will print the paper. If you print it on white paper, the chest will be white. If you happen to have black paper, it would be black. There is no data there. That's what it's telling you. When you clip all the way to the right of your histogram, there's no data. When you're like the middle one, when it's exposed to the left, we're missing a lot of the details of that bird. Speaking of birds, my bird is going again, and I know I'm running late, so I appreciate everybody hanging in there. The newer cameras on yours, Sid, and on the Sonys, and on my new mirrorless, I can set so that I'm looking through the viewfinder and it shows me the exposure. It also shows me the histogram. I have my histogram in my viewfinder all the time because it's the most important piece of information I want to have. I want to know what's happening with light. So again, we'll do a little bit of matching. And as I said, there's not a right histogram or a wrong histogram. You want to decide how you want to do it. There are times like A, where you want to be mostly shadows and midtones. There are not a whole lot of highlights in that picture. There's a little bit on the petals going up, but the histogram for that one is going to be 3 because we've got a whole lot of dark areas. It's an adequate histogram. It's a little bit dark, but it's okay. The histogram that's showing the ocean, rocks, and the sunset, That's number one. You're seeing mostly midtones in C. And histogram 2, with all the whites and the detail, is B. Again, different histograms for different things that you want to do. And the histogram 2 is clipped, but you've got pure black. There's no detail. There's parts of the picture that have no detail, but that's intentional on that photographer's image of that picture. But none of them are clipped all the way to the highlights, because if you clip highlights, you have zero data. So there's a function inside your cameras that allow you to alert when you're clipping highlights. And you see the ibis on the right-hand side blinking. This is a great service from this photography site to show you. That tells you there's no data on the back of the bird or the back of the bird's head. And it's telling you you must change your exposure by exposure compensation, or if you're manual, to go a tiny bit darker, because you really don't want to have shiny, no detail on those birds' feathers. So if you don't have your highlight alerts on, find your highlight alerts, and I will send out in a note where to find them. On Nikon, it's a little bit challenging. It's like a scroll in your menu. But when I view my pictures on the left-hand side, I will have my picture small, and one of the options is to have, there's two types of histograms. The histogram on the picture on the left where it says Canon is your dynamic range. It's your shadows to your highlights. You can also bring up histograms for your red, green, and blue channels, because if you're blowing one of the channels, like on a cardinal, you might want to do an adjustment. But at a minimum, you want to view your pictures when you do your display with your histogram. A lot of people blow them up full, but what you're seeing on the back of your camera may not be enough information. So always, while you're in the field, quickly review your pictures and have your histogram up, because once you're gone, you cannot fix blown highlights. There's nothing I can do in post-processing to the ibis's butt other than have another picture that was properly exposed and bring those feathers and clone them in, because they're gone. You have no data, zero. So find your blinkies, they're called, or highlight alerts. And I will send out a note. If you're not doing it, it can be annoying when you're reviewing your pictures, but once you start to look at that, it's the thing that says warning, danger, no data. We have no data here. And if we looked at the histogram of that ibis, you would see all the way to the right on that histogram, you're going to see it hitting the side there. And this one's pretty significant. Now, have I ever had a picture where the sky's blinking? Yes. If I take a picture and it's a really bright day and there's an eagle flying in the sky, I might have to blow all the sky to get that eagle, just because the camera can't deal with the dynamic range. Or on a rainy day, I might have a tiny bit of highlights blinking. Like when I did loon photography, there were some specular highlights, which are dots of water, and little tiny things were blinking, but it wasn't significant. It wasn't the eyes, it wasn't the feathers. You know, even on this ibis that's blinking, if the back of the head was blinking a tiny bit and the tail wasn't, I might say that's okay, but not that much blinking, not that much of the bird blinking. And again, it's trade-offs that you have to do. So what do you do if this bird is blinking like this? I can do exposure compensation. I can increase the shutter speed so less light's coming in. I can decrease the ISO. Different ways of doing the same type of thing. But be aware, because once you're gone, that image is gone. So here's an example of where in a Nikon you can find your highlight alerts. It's in on most cameras, it's in your playback display options. And in the Nikon, you have options for which way you want to do it. I tend to just do the overall data. And I think in the Nikon, you have to like just toggle down through you have to scroll through. This shooting data here, I tend to turn that off. So that's the other thing you want to adjust in your playback, what is coming up. File information I don't need. The overall data is the most important. And if you want the RGB histogram and then your highlights. If this was, again, the highlights would blink if you're having a highlight alert. But play with it and get your camera set so that quickly in the field, you can know which of these information is going to come up. And if you can't see the back of your camera in the field, like if it's a bright sunny day on the beach, there's a device called a Hoodman, and you can look, it sort of blocks the back and you look through it to be able to see. Sometimes I'll even like take my camera and put it in my coat or something and look down so I can see what's going on with the data. With the new cameras, digital, you can look in the eyepiece. And again, you get a lot of information on the back of your camera when you do review. This tells you that it's 455 pictures out of 999. The histogram's a good histogram. It's telling me there's a lot of midtones for this picture, which would be appropriate. You can see there's shadow on the side. The whites are good. Nothing's clipped. And I wouldn't expect this to be far to the right like a bird, because we've got a lot of sandstone and green, which are all midtones. It was done in P mode, which is program mode. The next to the P on the left tells me that it was done with evaluative or matrix metering. So the metering was an average of everything. The shutter speed was 1/320. The f-stop was f9. The ISO was 200. 12 is the focal length. The white balance was auto. And then other things. And this person is shooting in RAW and fine, which means they're shooting in RAW and JPEG. So know what your settings on your back of your camera tell you, and use the information when you're in the field. So, you know, if you want to see more of my photos, I do have a Zenfolio site. Some of them are older. You're going to see the evolution of my photos too. This is an older grizzly that was taken in Denali, and you know, again, things I would do differently, probably a little more shutter speed so his front paw wasn't as far out of focus. But you know, a good photo is one that reminds you of where you've been.